Good morning, everyone. Welcome to NISA's Summer Economic Forum for 2023. My name is Stephen Millard. I'm the Deputy Director here at NISA for Macroeconomic Modelling and Forecasting. And I'd like to introduce people who are speaking today. I'm going to give a couple of opening remarks. Then Barry Naisbitt is going to talk about the outlook for the global economy. Lisa McSorley is going to talk about the outlook for the UK economy. And finally, Arnav Bhattacharjee is going to talk about the outlook for UK regions and households. So this chart that we're about to see, this has been the key one that's been on the news this week from our outlook. And what it basically says is that it is only really by the middle of next year that the GDP in the UK will achieve its pre-COVID peak. Now, of course, the forecast and outlook went out on Wednesday, since when we've had a GDP number. It came out this morning, it was 0.2% in Q2 of this year. And that was 0.2 percentage points higher than we were expecting. So we were expecting flat GDP in the second quarter, but actually we got growth 0.2%, which is, of course, good news. But quarterly GDP still remains 0.2% below that pre-COVID level, the solid line in the chart. The United Kingdom is the only advanced country for which this is still true. The data also suggests the government investment in Q2 fell by 6.7%. We have been arguing for a long time for the need to increase public investment. We actually saw a 6.7% fall in the second quarter of this year. And finally, the GDP deflator, the implicit GDP deflator, inflation of that rose to 6.7% in the second quarter. And the GDP deflator is a very good measure, if you like, of domestically generated inflation. So all of these are warning signs, which I think we should offset a little bit against the positive news of the 0.2% growth in GDP in Q2. Anyway, against that background, I'm going to now hand over to Barry, who's not going to talk about the UK. He's going to talk about the outlook for the global economy. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and welcome everybody. Stephen says I'd like to present the main themes of our summer economic outlook for the global outlook. I mean, the global outlook is really a project that a team works on, and my thanks to the other members of the team for doing all the hard work. I'm just doing the relatively short bit of presenting it all. I'll be presenting an overview of our forecast, and it's worth saying that subscribers to our NIGEM model, which is the model we use to compile our forecast, receive a more detailed write-up of the forecast, but also a full set of forecast files for them to run the model on for their own interest or countries or research. So if you're interested in subscribing, this is a good opportunity for you. Let me start by running through our main key messages, and then I'll move on and illustrate them. So perhaps the main area focusing global economic data today, or debate today, really is about inflation. And this is really a sort of a major advanced economies problem rather than, I feel, a global issue. We see inflation as having peaked, at least headline inflation having peaked. I'll come back to that later. And we're looking at inflation falling over the next couple of years towards target rates. As a consequence, we think that there may still be some further monetary policy tightening, certainly in the euro area, and we probably wouldn't want to rule it out entirely for the US, although that's not in our forecast. But we think policy rates too will be near their peak, and we expect them to be a little lower at the end of next year than they will be at the end of this year. Emerging economies have had a more varied experience of inflation, and indeed we've already seen policy interest rates fall, for example, in Brazil. Higher inflation and tight monetary policy are contributing to weak GDP growth this year and next. This year we'll see, we believe, the weakest GDP growth apart from 2020, the COVID hit year, since 2009, and we expect both years, 23 and 24, to see global growth below 3%. And we think also likely moving further out to remain low relative to the more recent past in the decade pre-COVID. So let me move on and illustrate some of these themes. Inflation's been driven up in the advanced economy by two big shocks, COVID and the supply chain disruption that resulted from COVID and lockdowns, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Headline inflation has now peaked in advanced economies, and the key questions surround how quickly it will come down, and once it has come down, which we believe it would, as I say, how will it stay there? Will lower inflation be sustained? If I illustrate these themes, on the left-hand side, these charts are taken from our global economic outlook. You can see annual headline inflation, and you can see the euro area inflation rate peaking in October last year. US inflation peaked rather earlier in June. And I just wanted to throw in the point that inflation latest figures for both the euro area and the US, inflation is now half the rate it was at the peak. Japan peaked earlier this year and has not moved very much. But in contrast to that, at the right-hand side, you can see annual core inflation. Peaks in core inflation have been later, if indeed they have peaked, particularly in the case of Japan. And core inflation, even since a peak, has been much slower to fall. For example, in the euro area, we're talking about a peak of 5.7%, but inflation is still 5.5%. So the question is, although headline inflation is falling, core inflation is still high, and so monetary policy tightening has continued. In terms of monetary policy tightening, the tightening cycle, we believe, is ending, but it has been a very sharp tightening cycle and also a very strong tightening cycle, as these two charts show, in terms of comparing how policy rates have moved, both in terms of their rate of the increase in policy rates, but also the time period they've increased over. The increase has been very short or relatively short compared to some other periods, but also very sharp. And the key question really, hello Stephen, is whether inflation has come back to target or not, or will come back to target or not. Let me just stop there and see if we can get the charts back on the screen, please.
Well, while we're waiting for that, many apologies everyone for the slight technical glitch here. But while we're waiting for that, I should have said, if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to put them into the chat so that when we get to the end of the presentations, I'll be able to call on you to ask your question. Anyway, it looks like we're back in business, so I'm going to hand back to Barry.
Thanks very much. If we move on to the next slide, please, then we'll just see our outlook has inflation coming down relatively quickly, so that we get back to target rates end of 24, sort of, or end of 25. The key question is whether it will stay at target rates. We believe inflation will tend to be around target rates thereafter, but of course, that's in the absence of any shocks that we obviously cannot foresee at this point. If I move on the next one, please. As a contrast to the advanced economies, one can see that inflation in the emerging economies actually peaked a little earlier, but and has been rather volatile. I should point out that the solid black line, or blue line, I think it is, as for Turkey, is on the right-hand side axis rather than the left. So inflation at Turkey peaked, but at around 80% and has come down since, but is still around 40%. So very different experience. But even now, when we look at latest figures from China, they show actual deflation year on year, 0.3% in the latest month. So a rather different picture. And we have inflation for the major countries there, excluding Turkey, I guess, returning to around 2 to 6% range into 2025. So what does all this mean for GDP growth, or how does GDP growth link into it? Well, we have global GDP growth below 3% in both 23 and 24. As I say, the slowest growth years since 2009. One of the issues here is that we're seeing particularly a weak performance from the advanced economies. They're not, there's the pressure of monetary tightening is reducing or has reduced global growth. And that leads us to slow growth for the advanced economies over the next couple of years, and even a little bit beyond that. The emerging economies, a bit of a mixed picture. We tend to have a rather, probably relative to the IMF, negative view on Russian growth in Russia. But we can see growth in China has picked up, but the latest figures for China in terms of their exports and imports down somewhere around 12% year on year in dollar terms, suggest that there may well be risks there around this pace of growth in China. In terms of risks, we see that the key risks in the near term, we're still concerned about the possibility of US recession. US economy has been performing strongly. Indeed, Q2 growth was stronger than Q1 growth. But the yield curve, which has been traditionally a very good indicator, the slope of the yield curve, traditionally a very good indicator of the possibility of recession in a few months' time or a few quarters' time, is still heavily negative. The risk is that monetary policy may have been tightened too much, and that further out inflation may not be sustained at target rates as we go forward. And finally, we can't obviously forget that the war in Ukraine is still continuing, and the risks that poses both to the Ukraine economy, but also the global economy. And, you know, the key news such as the about turn on grain shipments could obviously lead to stronger inflation and some hardship in countries that are substantial importers of grain from that area. In medium term, I guess our one key view we have is growth in China will be moderate relative to the past 2 decades, which probably plays a little bit into slower than we have seen global GDP growth. And we actually think that advanced economies are likely to make a lower contribution to global growth than they did do over the past 2 decades. Let me just leave it there with the forecast summary, but also just quickly add that the global economic outlook itself, the full text of it, if you do receive it, does include other things than our forecast. We've got an article on prospects for emerging Central and Eastern European economies by Jakub Rybacki from the Polish Institute of Economics. We've got an article, we call them boxes, on a multilateral context for European and Australian economic cooperation by Paul Grattan from the Australian National University, and a box by Paul Mortimer-Lee, who used to be, for a time, Deputy Director here, on why did US inflation forecasts fail. And finally, we usually have a topical feature which uses our NIGEM model to examine a simulation of a subject that we think is at least interesting and topical. And this time we look at the short-term impact from a rapid increase in carbon taxes as part of the work and building on part of the work that NICE has been doing with the NGFS, the network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system, on developing and analysing economic scenarios to study the economic impacts of climate-related changes. So that's the full picture there. So let me leave that to and pass over to my colleague, Lisa.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Thank you very much for outlining the global picture. I'll go on to look at the UK economy, just to check, is the sound okay, everyone? Yeah, very good. And again, thanks to colleagues Paula, Haley, Stephen and Kamar for all the hard work on this. Okay, so first of all, I'll go straight on to inflation. Similar to the global outlook, UK inflation, the rate of UK inflation is falling. The 12-month CPI inflation fell to 7.9% in June, which was down from 8.7% in May, which was quite a considerable drop. Our forecast here at NISA, we forecast CPI inflation to fall to 5.2% by the end of 2023 and to 3.9% by the end of 2024. However, we do see it hovering just above 2% going into 2025. So just slightly off target, but still, you could argue coming down rapidly. And that is the overall, our core forecast for inflation. Underlying that is our core inflation, which is currently at 6.9%. And in terms of underlying inflation measures, we do see some upside risk to our forecasts here. That underlying core inflation seems to be a bit stickier, and on the next slide I'll go on to talk a bit about that. However, that is why we have skewed our forecast, if you like, to the upside risks in terms of CPI and the rate at which it will decline. So I'll talk a bit more on the next slide about the reasons for the risks to inflation. Okay, first of all, again, the UK Outlook is available now freely on the website. So again, you can have a look at the figures and tables there a bit more in depth if you can't see them too clearly on the screen. In terms of the drivers of inflation in the UK, as you can see by the black line, the kind of large energy price shock, the prices have largely fallen out of the CPI inflation basket, and that's the right-hand axis. So as you can see, the really steep decline in the price of energy that feeds into the CPI basket. However, one of the drivers means that it's shifted now towards food, non-energy goods and service prices. And what we're seeing is a slower reduction in those rates of inflation. What I would say in terms, if you look at the composition of the CPI basket, food makes up a greater proportion of that. And that is why the slowing rate of inflation has been stickier due to the food prices. Although they're coming down, that's the grey line, it's still there currently in our CPI basket. The other two measures that we've looked at are the inflation rates for non-energy goods and service prices. Non-energy goods are kind of plateauing at the moment around 7%. However, I think as input prices come through, reflecting the falling energy prices, transport costs, input costs, what we'll actually see in terms of the output of non-energy goods, we should start to see that inflation rate reduce quite rapidly, as we've seen in other countries. The one area that's quite unique to the UK is services inflation. So as a predominantly service-led economy in the United Kingdom, that is where we may differ slightly from the global picture. And as you can see from the diagram, that the service is around about 7%. Slight tapering down, slight tick downwards, but before we can be confident that that is a sustained downward trend, we may need to wait for a few more data points to come through. As I said, it may indicate second round and pass-through prices, and that may indicate service inflation may be a bit stickier for longer. However, that will depend on many of the other factors, whether domestic consumption can hold up, and we're seeing some evidence of people drawing on their savings to maintain their consumption, and at the point of which higher interest rates may bite and may actually reduce that consumption is will be reflected in time lags. So in terms of our forecast, the main drivers of inflation have shifted from energy to food, non-energy, goods and service prices. However, the upside risks we see is maybe coming through on those service prices, feeding into inflation. Okay, so next slide in terms of policy then. Our forecast is conditioned on the bank rate peaking at 5.5%. So when we closed our forecast, that was notably, it was below the market projection. So as you can see on a diagram, that the market line is in black. However, that has converged now downwards. So again, maybe we were on the right track to condition our forecast at 5.5%. But again, that depends on not just financial markets, but of course many other aspects. Overall, we would say the cumulative monetary policy actions have tightened the financial conditions. And in terms of our outlook for the forecast, what we would potentially say is it now the time, you know, in terms of communicating the kind of impact of monetary policy to make clear whether we think we are ahead of inflation, whether the lags that necessarily come through with monetary policy will take effect in the next year to 18 months. And again, that will be based on our data. We would maybe forecast that potentially the Bank of England has done enough to get in front of inflation, and as it communicates its trajectory towards target, it may wish to reflect how it communicates that. But as I said, ours is based on our NIGEM modelling, market outlook, all of the macroeconomic indicators and dynamics, as well as obviously the market curve as well. So that's a slight outlook. So our forecasts are conditioned in the market rate peaking at 5.5%. And I'll go on now to say more about the impact that may have on GDP growth. The diagram that I chose to present here is just to put our GDP growth in a bit of context. So looking back at the impact of the COVID pandemic in 2020, you can see the actual level of GDP hit that the UK economy took. And then as you know, successive reopening, and then as we kind of improved, we were then obviously hit with the war in Ukraine, and other supply side disruptions as well. So against this background, and I think that's important to bear in mind, the magnitude of the shocks that have not just faced the UK economy, but the global economy. It's important to now think about the UK's medium and longer term prospects for GDP growth. So we forecast GDP growth this year of 0.4% and 0.3% respectively. We were the first independent macroeconomic forecaster to forecast that the UK would not go into recession. We are still forecasting that, although we are highlighting continuing risks on the upside. And again, that mainly comes from inflation, the financial conditioning tightening that we're seeing coming through into the economy. So in terms of outward forecast, this is the area, and the Chancellor has said that you can have risk of a low growth trap, and we at NISA as well have long called for emphasis to shift to the medium and longer term thinking rather than chasing data points in terms of, you know, monthly data or forecasts as well. So I think in terms of forecasts, we need a bit of foresight and perhaps some forethought now as to how we move that into policy choices. But I'll go on to the next slide and talk about some signs in terms of our GDP growth and kind of supply side issues, particularly acute in the UK, and that is relating to our labour market. So the positive aspect is that there has been a fall in the inactivity rate. However, the cumulative number of long-term sick remains high compared to pre-pandemic levels. Although I would point out, compared to the 2007-8 financial crisis, the UK's inactivity rate is about 1.5% lower. So by historic terms, it's not an outlier. However, given the kind of acute labour shortages, given the tight labour market we're experiencing, it is more of an issue this time, and how we tackle that will give an indication about the future trajectory for growth. So overall, the labour market has begun to loosen slightly, a slight uptick in unemployment, fall in vacancies, but it does remain tight, again, by historical standards. We forecast a positive outlook for unemployment, with it increasing slowly to 4.1% in 2023, 4.7% in 2024, and peaking at 5.1% in 2025. So again, low by historical standards, and given the magnitude of the shocks that have hit the UK economy, it's quite an achievement. But we do need to think about how that is constraining growth and how it interacts with the other macroeconomic variables to ensure that we can maintain not just stability, but growth going forward. In saying that as well, we do expect wage growth to remain around 6% in 2023 and potentially into 2024. There's always a lag in wage growth compared to other factors in the economy. And I think this is the dynamics that we are all monitoring carefully and interested in. It is those time lags and the interaction between fiscal policy, monetary policy, labour market policy, and of course the global economy as well, and how it interacts. So thanks. Go on to next slide. In terms of households, and my colleague Arnab will go on to talk about the impact at a regional household level. At an aggregate level, just to say that real personal disposable income actually fell by 1.4% in 2022, mainly due to the impact of inflation. We expect a very slight improvement in real personal disposable income in 2023, just 0.1%, and then 1% next year. And that may come as a surprise, given that nominal wage rates are, forecast to maintain about 6%. However, when you take into account of inflation and then the withdrawal of, say, household support for the energy crisis, that is that dynamic playing out. So in terms of households, it may still be a while before they feel improvement. But as I said, in terms of over the medium term, we expect real personal disposable income to grow by around 1.4%. So as again we've said, maybe not growth to lead to catch up, but it is a slightly more positive picture compared to our previous versions of our outlook. Okay. Thanks. Next slide. In terms of fiscal policy, something we wish to highlight as well was the public sector net debt reached 100.8% of GDP in June, surpassing the 100% of GDP mark represents a milestone, albeit one that was expected, and indeed the OBR forecast it to be higher. So the actual outturn of the data is 1.5% below the trajectory of the OBR's March forecast. And the reason for this is due to lower cash debt and actually a higher GDP outturn than the OBR was forecasting. So although it's higher, as I said, maybe lower than forecast, but what I would say on that is, given the changing financial conditions, higher interest rates and inflation mean now that the government interest payments are on that debt are 3.8% of GDP in 2022-2023. And that is something to bear in mind, although it may be sustainable. And again, if you look historically, if you look internationally, the UK is not an outlier, but how that fits in with the UK's current fiscal framework and stated objectives may be something we should consider. Here at NISA, we've done quite a lot of research on the impact of quantitative tightening. And what I would highlight as well is that macroeconomic context. It's not just quantitative tightening on its own, it's how it interacts with other aspects of the macroeconomy as monetary policy and the tightening and higher interest rates and impact as well. So that's certainly something that we at NISA are keeping a close eye on and continuing to do more research into. Okay, next slide. Okay. So in terms of the fiscal position and its sustainability, again, we would urge looking now at the medium and longer term. The kind of highlights and challenges to public finance is highlighted by the OBR and ourselves in numerous publications on our website. With inactivity in health, energy and high debt. However, as we said, if we're looking at the macroeconomic outlook, given compared to previous quarters and the shocks we've had, it's how we turn kind of stability into an improved situation. And again, that's a challenge, I think, for all all economists, particularly macroeconomists working in this area at the moment. But NISA, we here at NISA have been arguing for some time now that the UK does have to think about its fiscal framework, particularly in light of these historically very high shocks. So a fiscal framework that provides enough flexibility, competence, and ensuring credibility, I would say, not just with the markets, but with the UK population as a whole as well. So what we would say is a fiscal policy that works for all. And again, looking forward to continuing the discussions and how we here at NISA and other colleagues contribute to that. I'll leave you with the forecast outlook table, again available now on the publication that's freely available on the website. Just to highlight our forecast for CPI inflation. So as I said, falling in 2024 to 4.4, in 2025 to 2.8, so and then to 2.4 in future years, so just slightly above target. And I'd also highlight unemployment as well, unemployment increasing to 4.8% and peaking at 5.1%. So again, on our current forecast, all other things being equal, positively you may say it's a macroeconomic picture of stability. Negatively, as we've highlighted, it does say there is that risk of stagnation, and thinking about where improvements in the macroeconomy are going to come from, given our supply side constraints. So I'll stop there and hand over to Arnab.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Barry and Stephen previously. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll as you know, bring to you our outlook, the NISA outlook for the devolved nations, England's regions and households. This is very much a team effort, collaborative work by an amazing team led by Adrian Pabst and including Max Mosley, Robin Smith, and Tibor Zendrai. As highlighted by Lisa, the aggregate picture, UK picture, is one of stagnating productivity, together with marginal economic growth with high risks on the downside and high inflation and high interest rates that are going to fall off only slowly. These latter aspects are also highlighted in our global outlook as discussed by Barry. So as might be expected, there are severe distributional consequences of this, in particular, deeply entrenched and even deepening disparities with low or no savings, little wage growth for lower income households, higher debt, and sharply elevated living costs. This is largely brought about by large shortfalls in disposable incomes, particularly for the poorest. Essentially, the regional picture mirrors this, as London and metropolitan parts of the Southeast power ahead, for example, in real wages, relative to other regions of the UK. Other regions, particularly industrial heartlands of the UK, they struggle. So if you look at the picture in terms of disposable incomes, the chart here shows that disposable incomes have fallen very sharply over the period since the pandemic. In fact, the shortfall is of the tune of something like 20 to 25% at the bottom decile, which amounts to a loss of some £4,000 or thereabouts in terms of disposable income for these households. The fall is also there all the way up to the median household, but comparatively proportionately less, as one might expect. Now, what does this mean in terms of, how does this relate to wage growth as such? In real wage growth, we see on the next plot or the table, a return of the squeezed middle. So largely from the period from 2021 onwards, the growth of real wages for the median earner is lower than that of the top earners. Of course, that is what we expect, but also to some extent, wage increases have remained a bit more robust for the bottom earners as well. Why is this? Of late, partly this is because of the increases in the national minimum wage and the living wage, but also generally welfare support, furlough, and so on and so forth. But certainly, all the way up to the middle of the distribution, people are suffering because of stagnating wages. This then has severe implications upon household incomes, and we can see on the next plot that particularly since the cost of living crisis and the war, which the war in Ukraine, of course, brought about together with severe problems with supply chains, there is increasing inequality in the sense of, well, of course, at the median as well, household incomes are falling in real terms, but it has fallen much more sharply at the bottom end of the distribution. So this is highlighted here. There was a little bit of decreasing inequality, reducing inequality over the period of the COVID supports, but that has now been replaced by a period of very sharply increasing inequalities. This then leads us to a widening disparity, as was mentioned, between prosperous and other parts of the country. So this is seen in the regional picture. In London, real wages will have grown by as much as 7% between the end of 2019 and the end of 2024, whereas in the industrial heartlands, particularly the West Midlands, we are projecting a 5% fall in real wages over the same period. So what are the implications if we look at the regions as a whole? Well, it is a mixed picture. On the one hand, there is London with 7% growth and real wages really staying very high, as much as 250%, 2.5 times that of the UK average. Southeast also staying somewhat higher than the UK average. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the West Midlands, where real wages were really around 85% of the UK average, or staying around 85% with a 5% drop. Wales is also struggling, and other regions are somewhere in between. The same picture can be seen on the plot here. On the left, you can see that in terms of post-pandemic growth, of course, the West Midlands in particular are struggling, but certain other regions, in particular London, on the back of really high real wages, the growth has persisted. So London has remained resilient. The metropolitan areas of the Southeast have remained resilient as well, but the same cannot be said of the rest of the country. So that is what is leading to this entrenched diversity across the country, divergences across the country. Now, this has implications together with the high interest rates. This has implications for the financial conditions of households as well. So, because of severe income, so because of incomes not keeping up with inflation, households are having to go into higher consumer credit, particularly unsecured debt. And this is a picture from the Bank of England. This is a plot from the Bank of England, which shows that the fastest growing part of unsecured debt is actually credit card debt. But credit card debt is not the worst offender here. In fact, many households in the bottom half of the distribution would not have as much access to credit card debt even. So they might have to go into payday loans and so on. And the interest rates there are much, much higher. As a result of this, and particularly because, as we can see from the plot on the next slide, that the exposure of bottom income households to high cost credit is very high. Their spending, their borrowing, increased borrowing is coming at a very high cost. We estimate that to average around 76%. This is a very high rate, and that is because of the exposure to payday and other similar money lenders and similar sorts of loan arrangements. Right, that leaves us with a similar situation for mortgages as well. So the housing is the part of the income profile or the spending profile that is coming increasingly into focus. As a result of very high interest rates, 3 million households who are nearing the end of their fixed rate deals, the average mortgage interest costs would have shot up since 2022. And we estimate that there might be about 50% rise in monthly income payments for many of these households, from about £1,200 to £1,800, as interest rates settle for the time being, at least on very high levels. On the chapter, we have a spotlight on housing costs, including mortgages and rents. I'm not going to talk too much about it right now, but I encourage you to have a look at it. In particular, the picture on the rent side is not that promising either. We are seeing something like 5% increase in rents across all regions of the United Kingdom, and that is fairly high by historical standards. And the case in Northern Ireland is a bit, has further increases, shows further increases, and we are studying that a bit more in the spotlight as well. Moving on, what we then suggest is the following. We think that a key purpose of financial stability is that financial markets should ensure that otherwise solvent borrowers, that is businesses as well as households, should have access to credit and are not pushed into insolvency due to fluctuations of interest rates. With that in mind, we suggest forbearance as a way to help mortgage holders in the medium run. So so that is one of our policy suggestions. So the banks and lenders should step in and offer easier terms for the time being because of the unusual circumstances in markets. So the key messages then, moving on to the regions, is that there is increasing divergence between the prosperous and poor parts of the United Kingdom in terms of productivity. The labor markets picture is interesting, but it is somewhat in flux at the moment, and we are observing this carefully. Unemployment and inactivity, though, are rising in Wales. Scotland and England are above pre-pandemic levels of employment. Unemployment is falling in Northern Ireland. That is the latest LFS figures show that, as well as the Northeast and Yorkshire and the Humber, but inactivity is higher almost everywhere. If you see the plot on the next slide, you can see that this divergence across the devolved nations, as well as the regions of the English regions, is clearly highlighted here. And in particular, we want to highlight the situation in Wales, which is on the next following slide as well, where employment is really faltering. And this is a place for some active targeted thinking and policy in our view. With respect to inactivity, inactivity is rising or is projected to rise almost everywhere, and we are seeing that as a combination of various reasons, ill health being one of them, but also other economic conditions. So regional inactivity across the developed nations and the regions are showing an increasing trend. That is on the next slide. There was a little bit of a dip in 2021, 22, and 22, 23, but subsequently it seems to be rising a little bit. So this is also an evolving picture that we are keeping an eye on. In conclusion, then, we feel that households in the bottom half of the distribution, they require, of course, sustained real wage growth, and that is necessary for the country. Housing costs are fast becoming a major burden, particularly with the coupled with the rise in unsecured debt. Regional employment and inactivity also require targeted intervention. Now, putting this all together, as we perhaps start thinking about prospects for growth and productivity in the long run, moving beyond the firefighting that we are doing at the moment, the focus must surely shift towards regional regeneration. And prospects there for the medium to long run growth, entails advancing good, green, and globally tradable activities and jobs, together with aligning skills to such jobs. Are we able to step up to the challenge? That is an important question. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnab. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, everyone. We have some questions in the chat, which I'll go to in a minute. There are 3 on fiscal policy, which I'll hold for now. Instead, I'll go first to Keith Wade. Keith, do you want to try and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for the presentations. It was on the global part of the presentation that I was interested in, because there's a lot of talk at the moment in the US about a soft landing, and I just wondered how the numbers played out in terms of the trade-off between the improvement in inflation that you're forecasting and the impact on unemployment. I'd be very interested just to see or hear what the model's saying on that. Thank you.
Well, let me pick that up then, Keith, and thanks for the interest in the global part, much appreciated. In the US, we've got basically a sort of, in terms of inflation, it looks like a gradual slowdown in inflation. So we've got the PCE deflator going from, or inflation on that going from 6.3% last year down to 3.6 this and 2.4 next, and then finally falling to 2%. But so sort of gradual picture there. Similarly, a gradual picture on GDP growth, where we've got 2.1% this year, sorry, 2.1% last year, I should say. We've got a bit of a slowdown this year, 1.6, and we see next year as being the slowest year, where we've only got 1%. And that sort of chimes in with the comments I made about risk of recession. In terms of unemployment, I think one of the really interesting stories is the Great American Jobs Machine, which has been generating jobs now consistently, probably against expectations for best part 3 years. We see unemployment rising a little bit, so we've got it going to 4% in 2024 when growth is at the slowest, and staying around that rate. We don't see it moving much back downwards to the sort of 3.6 we had last year. So it's sort of a gradual picture on the employment side and on the growth side, or growth slowdown, so rather than a precipitous change. I hope that answered your question, Keith.
Yeah, no, it does. No, thank you very much. I mean, all I would say is that does seem to be quite a favourable trade-off now, that certainly compared to previous cycles where we've obviously seen much more of an increase in unemployment. But no, thanks. That's really useful.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Barry. A long-time friend of the Institute, Peter Dixon, has one of the two questions on fiscal policy. So Peter, if you can unmute yourself, and then Lisa, before answering, there'll be a second one. So hold off on the answer and we'll take the two questions together.
Thank you very much. Great presentations, very interesting as always. I was particularly struck by Lisa's chart, which showed that the debt to GDP ratio is elevated and likely to remain so for some considerable time. But it strikes me that we're in a world in which there are increasing claims on state resources, thanks to aging populations, rising burdens on the health sector, increasing burdens on defense as a result of problems that we've seen recently in Ukraine. I'm just wondering what your views are with regard to the fiscal options available to governments to try and plug some of the gaps that we're seeing on the fiscal balance sheet. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And the other question, kind of related, is James Clayton. James, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question. James, are you there? Maybe not. So, okay, in the meantime, Lisa, do you want to have a crack at Peter's question?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, that is, I think, the big question and the big challenge. I think what I would say is there's certainly never been a greater need for independent macroeconomic analysis and independent macroeconomic research in terms of looking at this issue. I think that options need to be considered very much in depth. I think in terms of fiscal space, creating that, I mean, after the 2007-8 financial crisis, obviously the option chosen was austerity to cut back on public services. The question is now, how can we create fiscal space whilst also improving public services that were also hit recent shocks by the pandemic, and backlogs there, and also issues with education as well. So it is a very difficult time. I think the kind of benign economic conditions before the pandemic created enough fiscal space for massive interventions like furlough and business support schemes, etc. The question is now, how then can we obviously create that fiscal space in a way, as I said, that is benefits everyone as broad-based gains or shares the pain, depending on your perspective. I think one of the areas in terms of we don't talk enough about is investment. So really looking at options to actually boost investment that will deliver longer term returns for the UK. Sometimes though, investment can take many years to show benefits. So if you do invest in infrastructure, that's quite a good way of spreading the cost over a number of years, but then it can take a number of years to realise benefits in the real economy. So I think we do need that balance of kind of shorter term investments, potentially current account spending, but how you do that, as you said, is a risk. In terms of fiscal consolidation, as I said, previous routes have been about reducing the debt. We may want to or need to think about doing that over longer term time horizons, but again, in a way that you do that that's sustainable is a challenge. And again, the UK needs to think about maybe longer term, not quite suggesting a Marshall Plan, but just as the slide I showed with the context of GDP, it is worth remembering the magnitude of the shocks that have hit the UK and global economy when we think about our fiscal response. Another aspect as well we haven't talked too much about is actually demand. So in terms of actually boosting demand for UK goods and services, a lot of that ties in with Barry's presentation on the global economy. So, there's obviously geopolitical factors and risks there, as you rightly mentioned, with Peter, with say defence spending and geopolitical risks. But we do need to think about even in uncertain futures, how we can ensure demand for UK PLC products and services around the world. So certainly I look forward to engaging with colleagues on the line as NISA helps to contribute to developing that new fiscal framework. But I think it's, I would say, not business as usual, given the magnitude of the shocks that we've faced. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'll add to that we have a document towards the new fiscal framework on our website. I would highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in these issues. And I'll also reiterate the point I made earlier that despite GDP growing at 0.2% over Q2 this year, public investment fell by 6.7% in the quarter. And that's clearly not what we need to be happening just at the minute. I would just like to call on Arnab, though, a second, to see if to hear your thoughts, Arnab, as well, on what you think fiscal policy should be doing, and maybe how it might look to finance that in light of the work that you've been doing on households and regions.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, everyone, for your engagement with the work that we are doing. Yes, indeed. So I think the past few years since the pandemic certainly have been periods where fiscal policy has been challenged to try and support the unfortunate circumstances faced by certain households and individuals. I think as we move potentially out of this towards slightly more stable economic environment, I think the objective of fiscal policy must now look towards bringing about medium to long run growth and productivity increases. If that is to be done, so of course we have seen that because productivity has been faltering, real wages, while they have somewhat kept up at the top end of the income distribution, they have been severely impounded at the bottom end. But in order to maintain long-run productivity or bring about long-run productivity and growth, what we now need to do is to think about how we can create good, green, globally relevant, global tradable activities together with jobs and the skills that go with it. And whether we can do that together with regenerating the regions of the United Kingdom where there is a large amount of disjuncture. This is not only about public investment, but this is about a combination of public and private investment. And I think that is the space needs to be created where private investment can also come in together with public investment towards delivering these objectives. And that is where the questions need to revolve around now, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. I was going to say, I think a key element of this is going to be levelling up. I mean, London is extremely productive and is enjoying productivity growth. That's where you'll work with Adrian and the team have shown. But it's the other bits of the country. How can we improve productivity growth in the West Midlands and things like that? Richard Puffs has just posted a question. Richard, do you want to unmute yourself and ask it as it's related to this discussion?
Can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead.
My point is, having worked in regional government policies based in Brussels, I was wondering regarding, we see increased regional inequality in the UK. In the past, we had regional development strategies. And should we now look at more bottom-up policies at the regional level? And I don't know if many people have sort of referred to smart specialization, which has certainly been an area, or particularly regional development strategies. So it's more going from a sort of a bottom-up sort of, what does the West Midlands need to do itself to raise, that's my point, rather than sort of top-down.
Thank you, Richard. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. I'll just comment briefly. This is a very important question, though. I'm commenting briefly on this because maybe we are speaking in the same, echo chamber here. Yes, indeed. So, a large part of this, the modern planning and how you think about regions and places has to have a strong element of bottom-up thinking. And there we think that further progress in the process of devolution will actually help. So that is where, from the point of view of Westminster and Whitehall, where, part of the focus must lie, how to devolve appropriate powers to the regions to make it possible for them to try and create plans, credible plans for their regeneration, and how to support those plans then in a holistic setting. And I think there are two sides of this, and the two need to come together, and now is the time.
Thanks, Arnab. And on that note, I noticed that we're over time now. So thank you, everybody, for attending. I hope you found it interesting and stimulating. I certainly have. Thank you so much to the presentations, to Arnab, Barry, and Lisa. And well, we'll look forward to reconvening in 3 months' time, when hopefully the outlook for the UK may be a little bit brighter, maybe, than it has been of late. We'll see. Anyway, thanks everyone for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.